This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, this is Sheila Mahoney from LifeSci Hub here with Jeff Davidson. Today, I'm going to do a brief introduction and then we'll get right to the content of the discussion. Very happy to have you here, Jeff. Jeff is a PhD level statistician. He has over 30 years of experience providing various biostat as well as biometric services to the pharmaceutical industry. Starting with Roche. He's also been with Shire, Centocor, Endo Pharmaceuticals, Accenture. For the last 15 years or so, he has spent most of his time in the VP of Biometrics role or the global head. And he has now gone off on his own to offer his considerable experience as an independent consultant. And we're here today to talk to Jeff about his body of work and his vision for providing these services to the industry as a consultant. Hi, Jeff. How are you today?
Doing great. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. So you have spent over 30 years in pharma as a statistician. What are some of the ways in which you have made a difference in your role, if you could tell us?
Sure. One of the greatest things you can do for anybody is to be a mentor. And I've learned early on in my career that helping others to achieve their goals is critically important. When I first came into the industry, I was a journeyman statistician, and after a very short time, management noticed that I had some skills that were important in the managerial role, and I spent most of my career in that role. And having mentored a number of statisticians throughout, I'm very proud to say that there are many, many statisticians who are out there in line level, in managerial roles throughout the industry, and I helped them get their start. It's a source of great pride for me.
That's fantastic. I couldn't agree more. So you've also had some remarkable experiences as a biostatistician, which we will explore in great detail. Would you like to start with any particular experience?
Certainly. One of the first experiences I had in the industry was having been placed in a role as the leader of a particular therapeutic area. And I was given the opportunity to work on venlafaxine. This was at Wyeth Pharmaceuticals, which is now Pfizer, or part of Pfizer, and has been converted to that company. Venlafaxine was moving through its phase 2 into phase 3. I was able to meet with the FDA, negotiate the phase 3 program, and then put together all of the analysis plans for their phase 3 program. This was something, considering that it was my first role, really, one of my first roles in the industry, and it was quite a responsibility, and I was able to get through this with a great mentor of my own. And after a few years after I was gone from the company, this product got approved, but in great part it was due to having prepared all of those phase 3 analysis plans. So this drug now is on the market, has been on the market, and when it arrived to the market, it became a blockbuster known as Effexor. I was privileged to work with Dr. Davidson, who at that time was the head of the CNS therapeutic area. Great mind, and I had worked with him for that time while I was preparing those plans. An interesting side note of that is that many, many years later, I worked with his daughter in a role on the service side. So there's a lot of brilliance in that family. So I thank Dr. Davidson for getting me started in this area of research, and also I thank his daughter, Donna Daravan, for having provided a great source of leadership in project management when I worked with her on the service side. Another example of what I have done in the area of research is also at Wyeth. I was provided with a challenge. Ketoprofen was an NSAID that was marketed along with many other NSAIDs, that there was a concern over the safety of these products. The FDA wrote letters to all of the pharmaceutical companies that had produced NSAIDs that were on the market and said, you must provide us with information on PUB. PUB is perforation, ulceration, and bleeding. Every one of the companies then had to scramble. We're talking about the 1980s. And in the 1980s, there were very few resources to pull together data and to create a unified database with all of the studies. There were no standards. Every statistician was able to write the variables and create the programs using whatever code they wanted to and whatever variable designs they wanted to. I had to unify all of these. I had to identify the location of all the databases because they were in various locations. As we know nowadays, we use data warehouses and everything is in one central location. And we also have standards using CDISC. So I spent my time solving the mystery of where are all the data. Then I had to unify it. There was one missing piece. We had one study that just was unavailable. We couldn't find it, but it was critical. We had to have all the studies or the FDA was going to say, why didn't you prepare your response using all of the studies? Ultimately, after some pure luck, one of our programmers was clearing out his closet and found a tape. It turned out that that tape had on it the missing data. So we finally had the last piece of the puzzle. I was able to create a large unified database and analyze it using the FDA prescribed analysis methods, which were life table analysis. It showed that perforation, ulceration, and bleeding did occur with this particular NSAID, and it occurred the longer it was used and with increasing doses. There were more incidences of perforation, ulceration, and bleeding. Ultimately, this led to class labeling and a warning on these products that if taken for a prolonged period of time at increasing doses, that perforation, ulceration, and bleeding can occur. That was a very important contribution I made, and it was early on in my career. In the early 2000s, I was working at a pharmaceutical company that was dealing with pain products. During this time, they had prepared an application using the standardized methodology that was accepted at that time. That methodology involved using the experimental product and an active control, so therefore a product that was already on the market. And these studies were used to show that the experimental product was better than the one on the market, and you could get subjects to go through these studies because they were receiving pain control. Suddenly, the FDA changed how it was going to accept applications. And at that time, the decision was made to only accept studies for pivotal trials that were placebo-controlled. This caused a great amount of anxiety because the companies that had been developing these products never done placebo-controlled trials. Imagine giving someone in pain a placebo and expecting them to remain in the trial. So it's a huge challenge. Having had experience in the oncology area, I realized that there were survival methods that could be applied to the pain area. Ultimately, to make a long story short, the company I was working with, using my initial thoughts and then developing them, came up with what ultimately became the standard now for pain trials. This is the randomized withdrawal design, in which subjects come into the trial, are given an adequate amount of pain relief, which is then titrated up to an acceptable level for each subject in an open label phase of the trial. And at the point where they receive adequate pain control, subjects are then randomized to either active or placebo. Now, the subjects on the active drug are more than likely going to be able to remain in this trial for the entire duration. Those on placebo are more likely to leave the trial, even though they are given a rescue medication. It's not a very strong rescue medication. Ultimately, you end up with a trial that is now viable, where subjects can stay in the trial or leave. However, you do have an adequate number of subjects at the end of the trial so you can compare the proportion of responders on active versus placebo. This design was successful, and the company for which I worked got its approval for its pain products thereafter. Throughout the industry, this became the standard.
That's incredible. I wanted to get back to something you had said earlier, going back to the experience in which you created the 3 stats analysis plans. I believe it was for Effexor.
Yes.
So you had
Phase
said,
3 stuff.
yeah, and can you talk a little bit more about the impact that you had creating those stats analysis plans and the extent to which that informed the approval?
When you're putting together your phase trials, you ultimately need to ensure that you have the variables appropriate for the area of research. You need to ensure that you've worked very closely with the clinicians to ensure that you've determined the appropriate effect size, which is owned by the clinicians. And in collaboration with the statistician, a sample size is prepared. It's probably the most important thing you're doing when you're working together with the clinician, is determining that sample size. Once you've come up with the design and the methodology for how you're going to study the particular therapeutic area, then that sample size is determined. So working very closely with the clinical team, we establish that sample size, and the most common power is the ability to detect an effect, if it really is there, is 80%. And we went with 80% power.
Mm-hmm.
The methodology had already been determined in the phase 2 trial, so we knew how we were going to study depression and how we were going to determine that we had successfully alleviated depression. So the goal then was to ensure that the analysis plans that were written covered every facet of the experience. And this is something that every statistician must pay attention to. You've got to look at everything. You've got to ensure that when you look at the study events and all of the visits that are going to occur, that you cover everything. Every table, figure, and listing that is produced, which is essentially what comes out of an analysis plan, has to have the entirety of the experience. You can't leave anything out. If the FDA finds that you have overlooked a particular variable that you should have studied, you can't go back. You would have to then conduct a new study.
You know, this is a great segue into one of our other topics, which is when statistics is done in a way that perhaps does not result in that successful outcome. I believe you have a blood plasma product experience to share.
Yes, I won't mention the name of the company. However, I had spoken to the sponsors because they had developed a product which they were very proud of. They even pulled a sampling of the product out from a drawer. It was contained in a plastic bag, and they said, this product can survive in many climates. It can work. It will still work in the hottest climate. It'll work in the coldest climate, and it won't degrade. That's how proud they were of this product. They knew that it worked. Well, the lesson that is learned from this particular situation is make sure your design is correct, make sure that you have a statistician reviewing that design, and make sure that all the components of the conduct of that trial have a statistician reviewing them prior to conducting the trial. Why do I say this? They had omitted performing their randomization properly. Once you have your design and you've got everything written into your protocol, if you don't randomize properly, you destroy any potential to have a study that will pass regulatory muster. This tragic flaw doomed this product, and it doomed the company. There were thousands of subjects who had been enrolled and who had been through the clinical trial experience whose data could not be used for the approval. The lessons that I've always repeated, and I have on my LinkedIn page an article referring to situations like this. If you take a look, you'll see it. It's published, and hopefully everyone who's doing clinical research will include a statistician early on and throughout the experience of clinical trial. The FDA turned down the studies, there were 2 of them, with thousands of subjects, and told the company, you must redo these studies randomizing using proper methodology. It's a failure that is a lesson for all of us. Millions of dollars were wasted. Patients' experiences were wasted. And a product that could have been life-saving is not available on the market.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I'm just trying to think about how to formulate a question in a way that is going to allow you to answer it. Jeff, can you detail what is it that company didn't do that led to the failure of that drug product? What actions early on did they not take with respect to statistics?
As I mentioned, the randomization process is critical. You have to ensure that every subject has the ability to be treated by any one of the treatments that are being provided. That is, whether it be active or placebo. In this case, that ability for each subject to come in and be randomized to one or the other of the treatments was not performed properly. There were errors in the way in which that was conducted, and the FDA uncovered this immediately, ultimately leading to the failure of that trial.
And I think from what you had told me before, they did not have proper statistical oversight at the right point that could have ensured a proper outcome. Could you talk a little bit about what could they have done that would have ensured the proper and successful approval of that drug product?
Well, the first thing that you would have done would have been to understand that randomization must be performed by a third party. You can't do that internally because it leads to the perception that you have looked at what the treatments are. And every company for which I've worked has always understood that randomization has to be firewalled from the clinical team. So this was part of the problem. And it's a very simple situation. randomization can never be touched by the people involved in the clinical trial. Had a statistician been involved in the design, that information would have been clearly presented to the clinicians, and the company would have gone outside and they would have had that randomization performed by a third party.
So what you've given us today are two examples of very effective statistical methodology and also ineffective statistical methodology. And in your travels, you've seen both and are better able to guide a pharmaceutical company towards a successful approval. So I'd like to turn now, if we could, to your interactions with FDA. Could you tell us a little bit? You've had some great experiences communicating with FDA on the part of the drug sponsor. Can you give us some examples of the types of work you can do there, the types of work that you have done there?
Certainly. One of the roles of a statistician is to be an effective communicator and to ensure that when meeting with regulators, there is I'm trying to find the best way to word this. The way that I look at communicating with the agency is I try to partner with the agency and be on their side. When you go into a meeting with the FDA, it's a very interesting dynamic. You walk into a conference room where there's a long table. The FDA sits down on one side of that table. Sponsor lines up and files in and sits on the other side of that long table. So the dynamic already is set up to be an oppositional dynamic. Whenever I have met with the agency, when I have the opportunity to, I'll sit on the end. And I almost feel as though when I do that, I'm giving that silent indication that I am someone who is going to be fair, balanced, and going to listen to both sides of the question. And as a statistician, give an answer that isn't biased in favor of my position being part of the pharmaceutical company. So in my experiences, I have often been able to be successful by listening to the agency and participating in these conversations in such a way that it is never considered to be confrontational, and it is always a collaboration when I'm involved. So with regards to that, I've been involved in the end of phase 2 meetings with the agency where there's been a great deal of success. And also during the review, I've been involved in meetings with the agency where negotiations occur. It can be negotiations regarding the labeling. It can be discussions and understanding of the analyses that were performed to help the agency better make their decisions. So all of these things combined have enabled me to ensure that communication is open and it's fair and that the agency is willing to listen. In one case, I did ask the agency a question, and this goes back to an experience with a pain product in which the agency questioned a particular use of methodology. And the statistician on the team indicated that the sponsor had chosen the wrong, I'll just say the wrong matrix. I don't want to go into the details of it, but my question to the FDA was, we chose this particular matrix a priori, and we do so in a blinded fashion. You had the advantage of looking at the data after the study was unblinded and choosing something different. Can you give me a case where this is acceptable for the sponsor to do this prior or post unblinding, in which you would then say, okay, even though you wrote into your plans to use one particular matrix, now you're using a different one? And the response from the agency was, oh yes, we can give you a number of examples of these. At that point, I was looking for the body language from my colleagues on the sponsor side, and I was given the symbol indicating don't pursue it any further. It was more subtle than that, but the fact of the matter was the sponsor did not want to confront the agency on this particular question, and therefore we dropped it. And it's a lesson that you can go in a certain direction, but you also need to make sure you're listening to the people who are part of your team and ensure that even though you may feel that it's important to question a particular decision, that you're doing what ultimately your leadership at the pharmaceutical company wants to do.
Great. Now I'm going to go off script a little bit, and a couple of questions have occurred to me while you're talking that maybe we could ad lib, and then we can do a wrap up, because I think we've covered just about everything in your script, Jeff.
Yeah, the only other is let's make sure we cover the AdComs, because many potential clients are looking for statisticians who have experience having participated in advisory committee meetings. So we really need to include that.
Let me stop you right there. I'm going to go right into that question. Jeffrey, many pharmaceutical companies seek expertise at this level to assist them with advisory committee meetings. Can you speak to that experience of yours a bit?
Certainly. Able to participate due to circumstances, thankfully, in 2 advisory committee meetings with the FDA. The first of which was for a product for ADHD. During this advisory committee meeting, the statistician on the advisory committee asked me a particular question about the analysis that was performed on one of the phase 2 studies. And he asked to have a particular presentation of the data provided to him in a different way than it was presented. So I indicated to him that we would certainly be able to do that and would provide it to him after the break. This was an all-day meeting and we had a lunch break. Now, an AdCom has many pieces moving at the same time. So back at the sponsor, my programming team was sitting there listening to all of this, and at that time I had my BlackBerry on me, and during the meeting I texted them and I said, you must provide that particular graphic. Can you give that analysis in a graphic presentation and have it after the lunch break? And they were able to give me the answer and say, yes, we can do that for you. As it turns out, they did such a great job that they emailed me the graphic. We were able to put it into a PowerPoint slide. And of course, it was the first question that came up after the lunch break. We put the slide up, the presentation, the graphic was given so that the statistician could take a look at it. And the best thing that you can have happen is that the statistician moves off of that question from that point and doesn't continue to pursue it. So that was a successful situation. And it shows you that in life, you have to think on your feet in many circumstances. And here was a good example of where I was able to think on my feet, and at the same time, I had a great team behind me, and that's always most critical, to be able to produce what was needed and then provide an answer to that advisory committee that was satisfying so that there was a successful interaction. In a different situation, I was in a second AdCom in which the question that the agency was asking was whether or not an opioid was considered to be at this juncture safe, or whether it was no longer safe for prescribing. This was a 2-day advisory committee meeting, and during that time, I was called upon a couple times to provide information. The ultimate result was that the information was provided to the members of the AdCom, and it satisfied their needs. The information that was requested was on confidence intervals around incidences of abuse of the opioid in the general population of abusers. So it was an interesting experience. Ultimately, the advisory committee voted that this drug was no longer, that its benefits no longer outweighed its risks, and the product was taken off the market.
Interesting. Okay. So this is where I'm going to go off script a little bit. Okay.
Go right ahead.
So Jeff, data is becoming more and more important. It's always been extremely important. And yet FDA and other agencies are looking at it differently. They are concatenating it differently than they ever have before. Can you speak a bit to the trends that you see with respect to statistics and at the agencies, and how sponsors can prepare for that?
Certainly. Thankfully, over the past 20 years or so, or maybe less, a standard has come into place, the CDISC standard for data. And we have the SDTM standard for the variables, and we have ADAM data sets, which are created for analysis. ADAM stands for Analysis Data Model. And the ability to have the same standards across the entire industry has enabled the FDA to take a look not just at our product, but at other products in the same class.
Right.
So that the agency now has the ability to look for trends and look for safety issues. Ultimately, this means that the public will be exposed to less risk because the agency now can ask questions that it could never ask before. The questions will be such that any particular safety signal that emerges from one product will call into question all other products. And most recently, I was working on a product that had been long time ago approved. However, new questions were coming out about a particular side effect for this product. The agency wanted to know, can you now conduct a new study to look at this particular safety event? So products that are approved, that have been on the market, that the sponsor has no longer an obligation to study, are now going to require new studies to reassure the public and the FDA, therefore, that this product is still safe. So that's the trend I'm seeing, that more research is going to happen as a result of this ability to, as you put it, concatenate or to create large databases, and the whole field of analytics has arisen as a result of this. Years ago, you couldn't dream of doing analytics. Now, and the difference between statistics and analytics is that statistics is looking at how we can predict whether or not a drug is safe and effective. Analytics will take the mountain of data, look at it and say, or ask, what is this data telling us?
Yeah.
So you see analytics coming into play more and more. And the entire field of analytics has grown, and you'll see a lot more of that happening in the future.
Is that part of your services repertoire as an independent consultant?
Analytics is not an offering that I provide. I have been an industry statistician for my whole career. I have not been involved in analytics. I'm certainly interested in it, but I am by no means an expert in analytics.
No worries. Okay, so I actually did want to give you an opportunity to talk about your practice. So Jeffrey, if you could describe in a few words what your goal is to bring to the table to your pharmaceutical and biotech clients. What is it that you're seeking to accomplish for them? What would you like to offer them, and what value do you think you are able to provide?
Great question. What I'd like to provide to my clients is confidence. The confidence that they have an expert statistician who will enable them to move their product through all of the hurdles that will occur during the life cycle as it moves through development to approval and beyond.
That's fantastic. And I would also like to add, Jeffrey, if I may, that you have a remarkable ability to communicate, not only understand statistics at a PhD level and a level of 30 plus years in this industry, but just in our acquaintance, your ability to communicate it to the layperson, and communicating with FDA is of critical importance. So I would like to add that I believe that is an incredible value of your consulting practice to the industry, in the sense that you bring that excellent communication to the table as well.
Well, thank you. And I'll give you a little secret as to where my communication skills came from.
Okay.
And this is something that I generally don't get to talk about. Prior to moving into the world of pharma, I was a teacher for 14 years.
Oh, wow.
I taught special education to high school and middle school children. And when you are a teacher, you must have excellent communication skills for obvious reasons. So that experience enabled me to stand in front of a team of researchers, to stand in front of the American Statistical Association at meetings and present, to sit down across the table or at the end of the table with the FDA and communicate effectively with them. And most importantly, to effectively communicate with the teams with whom I'm working. So
the
with my
internal
colleagues,
stakeholders, right?
yes, with the clinical folks, with the regulatory folks, with the pharmacovigilance team. The ability to communicate is something that I have developed over time and that I myself work on every day. You can never learn enough about communication, so I'm always studying it and trying to improve on it.
That's fantastic. Anything you'd like to share with us in terms of the specific services that you provide?
Sure. I offer my services as not only a strategic advisor in statistics on clinical trials and on the integrated summaries of efficacy and safety. I provide the interaction with the agency that will enable a sponsor to be successful. I work with numerous functions within the biometrics domain, so I'm able to work across the data management and the programming and also the biostatistics teams, so that if a sponsor has that particular need to ensure that there's continuity throughout those teams, those members of the teams, then that's one of my strengths as well. I also offer a service to support data monitoring committees. And along with all the clinical trial activities, I offer the service of supporting the medical affairs department. That is enabling them to produce their publications and supporting their strategy, and then fulfilling their manuscripts, abstracts, and posters. So having been through all of these experiences in my career, and once again, I suggest you take a look at my LinkedIn page, you'll see that I've pretty much been there and done that throughout my career and in many different functions as a leader and as a journeyman statistician.
Great. Any other final thoughts?
Well, the sheer joy of being able to participate in pharmaceutical development has been something that has been extremely rewarding to me over these past 30-some years. And I see myself continuing to do this for many more years. I get bored easily, so I want to be involved. I want to help sponsors, and I want to continue to be a contributor to bring the best products to approval so that the sponsor can see their goals met and patients who need these products will have them.
Yeah, and I have to say, listening to you and hearing the depth and breadth of your experiences as a consumer of prescription medication, I would appreciate somebody like you being on the drug sponsor side, because the data is so important and it's so critical and yet fraught with risk, that if it's not handled correctly, and as you've demonstrated throughout this discussion, if it's not handled correctly, we as consumers could be missing out on excellent, very helpful drug products. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, well, this is Sheila Mahoney once again with Jeff Davidson from LifeSci Hub, and thanking you for joining us. You know what? I'm going to do some other wrap up because I didn't think of a way to wrap up. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I think we've covered it all. There isn't much more. So yeah, you can wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, I'll probably, all right, here. Let me do this again. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Once again, this is Sheila Mahoney from LifeSci Hub. If interested, contact info to follow. We are very much looking forward to connecting drug sponsors with the critical skills and independent talent that exists. And there are few better examples than Jeff Davidson from Alpha Kappa Statistics. Is it?
Alpha Kappa Statistics. Say it 3 times fast.
Alpha Kappa Statistics. I think I can only say it once. So
Great.
thank you very much. And thanks very much, Jeff, for joining us. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay,
Pleasure's
great.
mine.
Okay. So
All right.
I think, is the recording paused? The recording may not be paused.
You're paused on your end.